My son assaulted me and said go away, so I canceled his mortgage. Hours later, 30 missed calls. The evening air in the house was heavy, thick with a silence that seemed to hum with tension. The widowed father stood in the middle of the living room, his silver hair slightly mussed from the long day, his lined face carrying the weight of years spent in sacrifice and quiet endurance. The walls around him bore pictures of family, photographs of birthdays, graduations, and a smiling young man who now stood across from him, eyes blazing with anger. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The contrast between the framed memories and the present moment could not have been starker. The son, now in his 30s, was red-faced, his jaw tight with fury. He had grown taller and stronger than his father, his shoulders broad with youth and arrogance. In his voice was a sharpness that cut deeper than any physical blow. "You never gave me anything I didn't deserve?" He spat, his tone dripping with contempt. "Stop acting like I owe you my life." The words landed like a hammer against the father's chest. He blinked, stunned, his mind grasping at the memory of long nights working 2 jobs, of shoes patched instead of replaced, of dinners he had skipped so his son could eat. He remembered his late wife's funeral, the way he had stood alone and vowed to raise their boy with all the love and strength he could muster. And now, that very boy, his only son, looked at him with eyes full of disdain. "I only came here to talk," the father replied softly, his voice trembling, not with fear but with the ache of betrayal. "You are my son. I wanted us to sit, to understand each other again." The son sneered, his hand clenching into a fist at his side. "Understand? You don't understand anything. You're old, useless, clinging to the past like it means something. This is my life now, not yours. Stop interfering." The father opened his mouth to speak, to remind him of the countless sacrifices. But before the words could form, the son stepped forward and shoved him hard in the chest. The force sent the older man stumbling back, his hand reaching for the wall to steady himself. The physical pain was brief, but the humiliation was sharp, like fire running through his veins. "Go away!" the son shouted, his voice echoing through the house that the father himself had once helped secure. "I don't need you. I don't want you here. Just go away and never come back." The words hung in the air, heavy and irreversible. The father stood frozen, his breath uneven, his heart pounding in disbelief. His son's face was twisted in rage, unrecognizable from the child he had once cradled, the boy he had guided through scraped knees and broken hearts. Slowly, the father straightened himself, squaring his shoulders despite the tremor in his limbs. He did not retaliate. He did not lash out in anger. Instead, he let silence fill the space between them, a silence more powerful than any curse or accusation. His eyes lingered on his son, searching for some fragment of the boy he had loved, but found only a stranger hardened by arrogance and disrespect. The son's breathing was ragged, his chest rising and falling quickly. For a moment, he seemed to expect a reaction, a shout, a slap, some kind of retaliation that would justify his anger. But none came. The father's calm silence unsettled him, though he would never admit it. With a quiet dignity, the father turned toward the door. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though his very soul was weighed down by grief. His hand touched the doorknob, cold against his skin, and he paused for a moment, the silence pressing in around him. He wanted to say something, anything, but the words refused to come. Perhaps because none could capture the enormity of what had just been shattered. Behind him, the son muttered again, "Go away," softer this time, but no less cruel. The father opened the door and stepped out into the night air. The chill met him instantly. but it was nothing compared to the coldness left in his heart. The door shut behind him with a dull thud, sealing the distance between them. He stood for a long moment on the porch, staring into the darkness, his breath misting in the air. Inside, the echoes of betrayal still rang in his ears. His chest ached, not from the shove, but from the realization that the son he had devoted his life to no longer saw him as a father, but as a burden to be cast aside. As he walked slowly down the path away from the house, his footsteps crunching on the gravel, a storm began to gather deep within him, not of rage that flared and died, but of something quieter, sharper, and far more dangerous. It was the kind of storm that brewed with patience, the kind that would not be forgotten, the kind that would one day find its release. The night was cold, but it was not the weather that made him shiver as he sat alone on the edge of his bed. The widowed father, still in his late 60s, but carrying the weariness of a man much older, felt as though the walls of his modest home were closing in on him. The echoes of his son's voice, sharp, cruel, and final, bounced endlessly inside his mind. "Go away. I don't need you. I don't want you here." The words had been daggers, and now they twisted deeper with every memory that rose unbidden to the surface. He clasped his hands together, the rough calluses a reminder of years spent laboring. His fingers trembled slightly as he remembered the long nights when his son was still a boy, asleep in the other room. He had worked shifts at the factory and the grocery, sometimes going without sleep just to make sure there was food on the table and clothes on his son's back. He had sold the last piece of his late wife's jewelry during a particularly hard winter, just so his boy could have new shoes and a warm coat. None of that mattered now, it seemed. His chest tightened as he thought of her, his wife, the woman whose loss had nearly destroyed him all those years ago. At her funeral, standing before the coffin with his son clutching his hand, he had promised her that he would protect and raise their boy with everything he had left inside. He had sworn that their child would never know the cold edge of neglect or abandonment. And now, decades later, that very child had shoved him aside, as though the years of sacrifice were nothing more than dust swept away in anger. Tears burned his eyes, though he tried to blink them back. Crying, he always believed, was something to be done alone, in silence. His son must never see him weak, never know the depth of his vulnerability, but tonight there was no hiding. The tears slipped down his face, hot against his skin, mixing with the chill of the night air. Humiliation gnawed at him. Not the humiliation of being shoved his body had endured worse in his youth, but the humiliation of being treated as worthless by the one person he had lived for. It was a wound far deeper than any physical blow. How had it come to this? He replayed the years in his mind like an old film, searching desperately for the moment everything had shifted. Had he been too strict? Too soft? Had he given too much or not enough? Every father makes mistakes, he told himself, but surely his love had been clear. He had been there at every milestone. The first day of school, the first scraped knee, the nights spent nursing his son through fever. He remembered saving for months to buy his son a guitar after he begged for one, even though it meant going without new clothes for himself. He remembered standing proud at his graduation, the joy outweighing the ache of his thinning wallet. And most of all, he remembered the nights when loneliness threatened to crush him, but he had kept going because his son needed him. Disbelief weighed heavy, suffocating him. Could the boy he raised truly see him as nothing more than a nuisance? Could blood really turn so cold? The question circled in his mind, cruel and unrelenting. He wanted to believe it was just anger, a passing storm of words spoken in the heat of the moment. But the shove, the venom in his son's eyes, told a darker truth. That rejection had been deliberate, intentional, perhaps even long festering. The father's body trembled, not with rage, but with the ache of betrayal. It was as if his heart itself had been discarded, trampled underfoot by the very person for whom he had lived. The silence of the room around him seemed to mock him, whispering reminders of how empty his world truly was without his son's love. He buried his face in his hands, whispering into the darkness, "What did I do wrong?" His voice cracked, raw from the weight of grief. But no answer came, only the hollow echo of his own pain. Slowly, he lifted his head and looked toward the window. Outside, the moon cast its pale glow over the yard, the same yard where he had once taught his boy how to ride a bike, running behind him until his legs ached and his lungs burned, cheering when he finally pedaled on his own. That child had looked back then laughing, eyes bright with trust. Where had that child gone? The father sat still for a long time, his heart heavy with sorrow, his spirit crushed under the burden of loss. He had endured many hardships in his life, poverty, widowhood, loneliness, but this betrayal cut deeper than them all. For the first time, he wondered if the love he had poured out for decades had been in vain, if it had all led to this moment of rejection. The tears finally subsided, leaving him hollow, empty, and silent. He was not yet angry, not yet plotting. In this moment, there was only heartbreak, humiliation, and disbelief so profound it left him feeling like a stranger in his own life. The room was still, the only sound the faint ticking of an old clock on the wall. The father sat hunched in his chair, his hands clasped tightly, as if by holding them together he could keep himself from breaking apart. His son's cruel words echoed in his mind, but now they blended with another sound, the voices of the past, faint and distant, calling him back to the years when everything had been different. He remembered the factory floor, the screech of metal, and the constant hum of machinery that had been the soundtrack of his youth and middle age. Long before the gray had overtaken his hair, he had spent 12-hour shifts, working under harsh fluorescent lights, his hands raw and blistered, his back aching. When other men went home after one job, he walked across town and began another, stocking shelves in the dim hours of night. Sleep became a luxury, a few stolen hours on a worn-out couch before he rose again to provide for the boy waiting at home. There had been times when the refrigerator was nearly empty, when bills threatened to bury them both. He could still see the final notice letters, the way they piled up on the kitchen table like silent threats. And yet, somehow, he always managed to make sure his son never went hungry. Sometimes it meant his own stomach remained empty, but that sacrifice was never in question. He told himself, "This is what a father does." The memory shifted, and he saw his son as a little boy, sitting at a worn wooden table, his tongue sticking out in concentration as he tried to finish his homework. The father had sat beside him, nodding with encouragement, even though his eyelids threatened to close from exhaustion. He had promised himself that no matter how tired he was, he would never be too tired for his son. Education was the key, he always said. If his boy could learn, if he could rise above the hardships, then everything would have been worth it. He remembered the joy of receiving his son's report cards, good grades, written in neat red ink across the page. The pride in his chest had been enough to erase the bone-deep fatigue he carried, and when the time came for college, he had poured every penny, every ounce of strength into making sure the tuition was paid. He had taken on extra shifts, sold his car, and even borrowed against the little savings he and his late wife had set aside. Every sacrifice was made with a single goal: to give his son a future brighter than his own. The flashbacks came in waves now, each one bittersweet. He remembered his son's wedding day, standing beside him with a trembling smile. The father had helped pay for the ceremony, dipping into the last reserves of his finances so his son could have the day he dreamed of. He remembered pressing the envelope of money into his son's hands when he and his new wife struggled with their first down payment. He had told them, "Don't worry, I'll help. That's what family is for." The words had been spoken with pride, not regret, for he believed he was building a legacy of love and support. And now, years later, the very house his son lived in bore his fingerprints, his labor, his sacrifice, yet he had been cast out of it like a beggar at the door. The memories grew sharper, almost painful. He saw himself in the rain, walking home after another endless shift, his clothes soaked through, yet smiling because he had bought a second-hand toy his son had begged for. He remembered the nights when loneliness clawed at him, missing his wife so much it felt like an open wound, but pushing through because his son needed him whole. He remembered the laughter they once shared, the bond they once had, a bond he thought unbreakable. The contrast between then and now was unbearable. How had a life built on sacrifice, love, and devotion led to rejection so cruel? He had given everything, his youth, his strength, his dreams, only to be met with disdain. The father's chest tightened as he thought of his son's shove, the venom in his words. The betrayal stung deeper when weighed against the sacrifices that had brought them here. His heart ached, but beneath the ache stirred something new. Pain was transforming into something else, something heavier, darker, and sharper. The flashbacks reminded him not only of his sacrifices, but also of the truth. His son had everything because of him. Every opportunity, every success, every step forward had been bought with the sweat and blood of his father's labor. And if his son could not see that, if he could not respect or value it, then perhaps it was time he learned. The father leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on the ceiling, his mind alive with memories and sorrow. Yet beneath it all, something was awakening. The sacrifices of the past were not wasted, but neither would they be forgotten. They would become the foundation for what came next. The house was silent, the kind of silence that seemed alive, pressing in on every corner. The father sat at the kitchen table, his hands flat on the wood, staring at the faint scratches and dents that told the story of decades past. This table had been the heart of his family once, where homework was done, meals were shared, laughter rang out, and birthdays were celebrated with simple cakes. Now, it felt like a grave marker, a reminder of everything lost. His son's words still echoed in his ears, venomous and sharp. "Go away. I don't need you. I don't want you here." The image of being shoved by the very child he had raised seared into his mind. He had felt the sting on his chest where the shove had landed, but that pain had faded. What remained was worse: the humiliation, the rejection, the cold truth that he had been cast aside. For hours, he sat there unmoving, grief washing over him in relentless waves. Tears had come earlier, unbidden, sliding down his weathered face until there were no more left to give. Now, there was only emptiness, a hollow pit in his chest. He tried to reason with himself, to search for excuses on his son's behalf. Stress, anger, the pressures of life. But no excuse could justify the cruelty of those words or the violence of that shove. His gaze drifted to a photograph that hung crookedly on the wall nearby. It was of his son as a boy, missing a front tooth, smiling brightly with arms wrapped around his father's neck. That smile had once been his reason to endure, to push through fatigue and hardship. That boy was gone now, replaced by a man whose eyes had hardened and whose heart seemed to have closed. The father felt something shift inside him as he looked at that photo. Grief alone was not enough anymore. He closed his eyes, breathing slowly, deeply. The sorrow that had drowned him began to recede, leaving behind something denser, heavier. It wasn't rage. Not yet. It was a quiet, steady fury, the kind that burned low but hot, capable of lasting far longer than a moment of anger. His heart no longer felt broken in the same way. It felt hardened, tempered by betrayal. He thought of every sacrifice he had made, every hour of labor, every dream deferred so his son could rise higher. He thought of the nights spent alone, while his son built a life, believing his father would always be there as a foundation, as something reliable and unshakable. He thought of the mortgage he had quietly paid, ensuring his son and daughter-in-law had a home they could call their own. And now, he, the very architect of their stability, had been shoved out as though he were nothing. The weight of that realization pressed down on him. His sorrow curled inward, transforming into something sharper. For the first time, he allowed himself to imagine a different future, one where his sacrifices were no longer taken for granted, one where his son would learn the value of respect not through words but through consequences. He rose slowly from the chair, his movements deliberate, his breath steady. The house creaked around him, the old floorboards groaning as if in protest. He walked to the window and stared out into the night. The moon hung pale and distant, casting a cold light over the yard. He remembered teaching his son how to ride a bicycle there, running behind him, cheering with every wobbling attempt. That memory, once sweet, now felt like salt in an open wound. His hands tightened into fists at his sides. He unclenched them deliberately, forcing calm into his body. Fury without control was useless. It burned fast and left nothing behind. But fury harnessed, tempered like steel, could carve a new path. The father understood that now. He whispered to himself, his voice low but firm. Enough. It was not a word of surrender, but of decision. Enough of being humiliated, enough of being cast aside, enough of enduring silently. In the stillness of that moment, he felt a clarity he had not known before. He would not confront his son with anger. He would not scream or fight. Instead, he would act with patience, with intelligence, with precision. His son had taken everything for granted, his father's sacrifices, his support, his loyalty. Now, he would learn what it meant when all of that was withdrawn. The father's sorrow had birthed something new, resolve. The breaking point had come and gone, and from its ashes rose a quiet fury that would not rest until balance was restored. He turned from the window and moved through the house, his steps slow, thoughtful. Each picture on the walls, each memory-laden object, seemed to whisper of the past. He touched the edge of a photograph gently, then withdrew his hand. The past could not be changed, but the future was now in his hands. Alone in that silent house, the father felt the first stirrings of a plan, though it was still only a shadow in his mind. For the first time since the shove, since the insult, he no longer felt powerless. His son had believed him weak, useless, old. Soon enough he would see just how mistaken he was. The father sat at his desk, a sturdy oak piece, worn smooth by decades of use. The drawers were filled with papers, bills, receipts, and carefully folded documents that told the story of his life. For hours he had wandered the house, restless, his mind heavy with grief and fury. Now, at last, he sat with purpose. He opened the first drawer slowly, the hinges creaking, and sifted through old letters, tax returns, and bank slips. He wasn't searching for anything at first, only trying to occupy his thoughts, to distract himself from the sting of his son's rejection. Yet as his fingers brushed across a thick envelope tucked toward the back, he paused. It was one he hadn't looked at in years, its edges yellowed, the paper inside folded neatly. He pulled it out, heart thudding in his chest, and opened it carefully. The words stared back at him. Mortgage agreement. For a long moment he simply stared, memories rushing in. He remembered the day his son had asked for his help, years ago. His son and daughter-in-law had been young, eager to buy a house but short on credit. They had turned to him, not with arrogance, but with desperation, and he had not hesitated. Of course, he had said back then, proud to give them the start they needed. He remembered sitting in the bank office, pen in hand, signing as co-signer and guarantor, ensuring the mortgage went through. He had told himself it was nothing, that his only wish was to see his son settled, secure, and happy. But the document before him told a different truth. He had not just signed, he had been granted a controlling interest, the final authority in the agreement. The bank, cautious about lending to a young couple, had insisted on the father's name remaining primary until the balance was nearly paid. At the time, it had seemed irrelevant. Now, it was anything but. His hands trembled slightly as he traced the ink of his own signature, old but steady, at the bottom of the page. He realized, with dawning clarity, that he still held power, real, tangible power. The house his son and daughter-in-law lived in, the very one he had been shoved out of, was tethered to him by law. Without him, it could vanish like smoke. A spark flickered in his chest, small but undeniable. His son had shoved him, humiliated him, cast him aside like a burden. But what would his son do if the ground beneath his feet was suddenly pulled away? What would he say if the roof over his head, the roof the father had helped secure, was threatened? He leaned back in his chair, the creak of the wood echoing in the quiet room. The sorrow of the past few days began to shift, replaced by a sense of awakening. He was not powerless. He was not helpless. His son believed him weak, but this document was proof that he was anything but. The father's eyes scanned the details carefully, noting the clauses, the fine print he had once overlooked. The bank still recognized his authority. His son, blinded by arrogance, had likely forgotten or perhaps never understood that his father's name was the one truly holding the house together. He thought back to the moment of betrayal, the shove, the venom in his son's eyes. The memory stung, but now it was tempered by the knowledge that he held something his son could not dismiss. Respect could not be demanded, but consequences could be enforced. He placed the document gently on the desk, smoothed out the creases, and allowed himself a slow, deliberate breath. His sorrow had begun to transform the night before into quiet fury. Now, with this discovery, fury sharpened into intent. He would not wield this power recklessly, but he would not let it go unused. For decades, his sacrifices had built his son's life. It was his labor, his patience, his love that had paved every step. And yet, his son had seen him as an old fool, someone to shove aside. Very well, then. If that was how his son viewed him, it was time to remind him that even fools could change the course of lives when armed with wisdom and leverage. The father sat in silence for a while, the contract before him, the clock ticking steadily in the background. His thoughts were no longer aimless, no longer clouded by grief. They were clear, measured, and precise. This was no longer just about pain. It was about balance, about restoring the respect that had been trampled underfoot. He folded the mortgage agreement back into its envelope, but this time he placed it at the very top of the drawer, within easy reach, his lips pressed into a thin line. The spark of an idea had taken root, and in the quiet of his home it began to grow. The kettle whistled softly, its shrill call cutting through the stillness of the house. The father moved with deliberate slowness, lifting it from the stove and pouring steaming water into a chipped ceramic mug. The scent of tea leaves rose with the steam, familiar and calming, a ritual that had accompanied him through years of hardship. His late wife had always made tea during moments of uncertainty, and now he found himself repeating the gesture, almost as if her presence lingered in the simple act. He carried the mug to the small table by the window and lowered himself into the chair with a quiet sigh. The night beyond the glass was dark, the yard bathed in silver light from the moon. He stared at it for a long time, his hands wrapped around the mug, the warmth seeping into his weathered palms. The tea sat untouched. He wasn't thirsty. He simply needed something to hold, something to anchor him while his mind traveled deeper into its storm. His chest still ached from the memory of the shove, the words his son had spat at him like poison. Yet now those emotions no longer left him drowning. The tears were gone. The frantic questions, "What did I do wrong? Why doesn't he see?" had faded. In their place was a steady, simmering clarity. He was no longer broken by grief. He was sharpening, becoming something harder, stronger, and far more deliberate. He sipped the tea finally, letting the bitterness spread across his tongue. He thought of the mortgage papers he had rediscovered, their neat legal text, and his own signature still etched in ink. That document had changed everything. It had shifted him from a powerless old man into someone who still held the reins, even if his son had forgotten it. That knowledge was no longer just a spark, it was a foundation. The father's gaze returned to the window. He thought of his wife again, the promises he had whispered at her grave, that he would raise their son well, that he would pour everything into giving him a life of security and love. He had kept that promise, but his son had grown arrogant, blind to the roots of his own stability. Perhaps, the father thought, it was time to teach him a lesson not out of cruelty, but necessity. Respect could not be begged for. It had to be earned. And sometimes it had to be demanded in ways that left no room for denial. He set the mug down gently, his fingers tapping against the wood of the table in a slow, rhythmic beat. The sound steadied him, a reminder that patience had always been his greatest weapon. When his wife had died, when he had worked nights upon nights without rest, it was patience that carried him through. Now patience would be the soil in which his resolve took root. His mind turned over the possibilities. He would not confront his son in anger. That would only give the young man more fuel for his arrogance. No, his son needed to feel the weight of his disrespect in a way that words could never convey. He needed to see what happened when the hand that built his comfort withdrew. The father leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing slightly. He pictured the house, the one his son and daughter-in-law walked through, as though it were theirs alone. He thought of the meals eaten at the dining table, the parties thrown in the living room, the arguments and laughter and ordinary days lived within its walls. All of it rested on a single truth. Without him, that house would crumble. A calm washed over him, deeper than sorrow, steadier than rage. It was the calm of a man who had decided. He did not smile, but there was a weight in his eyes now, a gravity born of certainty. He would act. Not tonight, perhaps not even tomorrow, but soon. And when he did, his son would understand not with words, not with another pointless lecture, but with consequences that could not be ignored. The tea had grown cold by the time he lifted the mug again. He drank it anyway, the bitterness now a comfort, a reminder that not all things were sweet, that life demanded hard lessons. When the clock struck midnight, he rose, carried the mug to the sink, and washed it clean. His movements were slow, methodical, unhurried. He dried the mug and set it back in its place on the shelf. Then, without another word, he turned out the light and stood in the darkness of his quiet house. Grief had hollowed him out, but in its place now stood resolve, silent, unwavering, and ready. The morning light crept slowly into the small living room, filtering through thin curtains and stretching long across the wooden floorboards. The father sat at his worn oak desk, the same desk he had used to sort bills and write letters for decades. It was not the first time he had opened the bottom drawer, but today his purpose was different. Today he was not a grieving father or a cast-off parent. He was a man taking inventory not just of paper and ink, but of years, of sacrifices, of undeniable truths that his son had chosen to forget. He pulled out a dusty box, its lid slightly frayed from age. Inside lay the artifacts of a life spent in service to family. The first item he reached for was a stack of receipts, yellowed slips from a hardware store 20 years past. He remembered the nights he worked overtime, stretching his body thin just to afford the materials to repair the leaking roof of their first modest home. He held the receipt between his fingers, the faint print barely legible, and smiled bitterly. His son had been a boy then, too young to understand how much sweat went into every nail hammered, every shingle placed. Now, that same boy, grown into a man, lived in a house that stood because of his father's unyielding devotion. Next came the tuition statements, thick envelopes once dreaded but always paid. He spread them across the desk, one after another, like a deck of cards. Each one bore his name, each one a testament to his relentless pursuit of his son's future. The ink totals stared back at him, amounts that had drained his savings, forced him to take night shifts, and left him with little more than exhaustion at the end of each day. His chest tightened as he looked at them. These were not just numbers. They were sacrifices translated into education, into opportunity, into the very life his son now enjoyed with such reckless entitlement. He reached further into the box and found a bundle of letters tied neatly with string. His late wife's handwriting graced the envelopes, delicate and slanted. He untied the bundle carefully, as if disturbing the string might unravel memories best left intact. The letters were filled with her words of encouragement during his hardest days, reminders of why they worked so tirelessly, dreams they had for their son. One line struck him like a blade. "He will never forget what you've done for him." He pressed the letter against his chest for a long moment, eyes closed, breathing in the faded scent of paper and time. Yet that promise had been broken. His son had forgotten. Or worse, he had chosen to erase it from memory. With slow hands, he laid out photographs on the desk. There was one of his son holding a baseball bat, his father standing behind him with arms steadying his grip. Another showed graduation day, his son in cap and gown, smiling proudly, while the father stood beside him, pride radiating from every line of his face. He traced the edges of each photo, his thumb brushing over the younger version of himself, weary but determined. These images were not just moments. They were evidence of love, of investment, of time poured out like water from a never-ending well. Finally, at the bottom of the box, he found a folded contract, the mortgage documents he had remembered days before. He unfolded the pages carefully, the legal jargon cold and unfeeling. Yet it was all there. His name, his control, his son's dependence masked as ownership. This was not just paper, it was power. Quiet, undeniable power that his son had never truly acknowledged. He sat back in his chair. The evidence spread out before him like a courtroom display. Each receipt, each letter, each photo was a reminder that he had not failed as a father. He had done more than most would ever dream of doing. The failure was not his. It belonged squarely to the son who had shoved him, told him to go away, and spat on decades of sacrifice with a single cruel gesture. The father exhaled slowly, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. But this weight was different than before. It did not crush him. It steadied him. It hardened his resolve. Every artifact before him whispered the same message. You have the right. You have the means. You have been patient long enough. He gathered the documents into neat piles, his movements precise and deliberate. He placed the letters back into their bundle, the photographs into their envelope, and the receipts into a folder. The mortgage papers he kept separate, laying them flat on the desk where his eyes could fall upon them easily. The room was silent, except for the ticking of the clock. He looked around at the evidence of his life's work, the undeniable record of his love and devotion, and felt a calmness seep into his bones. He had not imagined his sacrifices. They were real, tangible, inked and imprinted forever. When his son next faced him, the father knew he would not come as a broken man begging for respect. He would come armed with the truth, and the truth had a weight heavier than any insult or shove could ever carry. The morning air was crisp as the father stepped outside, the faint chill clinging to his coat. He had slept little the night before, his mind replaying the moments at the desk when he had laid out the relics of his sacrifices. The receipts, the letters, the photographs, all of them had affirmed his worth, his devotion, and the betrayal he now bore like a wound. But the mortgage documents, folded neatly in his leather satchel, were what gave him strength. They were not just paper. They were a weapon. And today he intended to discover exactly how sharp that weapon could be. The law office was nestled in the heart of town, a modest building with brass lettering on the glass door. He had been here before, years ago, when the mortgage had first been signed. The memory of that day stung bitterly now. He had walked in proud, believing he was helping his son take a step toward independence, toward security. He had thought himself generous, even noble, in shouldering the responsibility of co-signing. Now, as he gripped the handle of the door, that memory curdled into irony. Inside, the air smelled faintly of polished wood and old books. A receptionist greeted him kindly, and within minutes he was ushered into the office of Mr. Harrington, a lawyer he had known for decades. The man was older now, his once dark hair streaked with white, but his sharp eyes remained unchanged. He rose to shake the father's hand with a firm grip. "It's been a long time," Mr. Harrington said, gesturing for him to sit. "What brings you in today?" The father placed the satchel on the desk and pulled out the documents with steady hands. "I need to know my rights," he said quietly. "This mortgage, it still bears my name. I need to understand what control I hold over it." The lawyer adjusted his glasses and began leafing through the pages. The silence stretched as he read carefully, flipping from one section to another, his expression tightening with concentration. The father sat still, his hands clasped together in his lap, his eyes fixed on the grain of the wooden desk. His heart beat steadily, but beneath it lay a current of anticipation. Finally, Mr. Harrington set the documents down and looked at him. "You have full rights," he said firmly. "You are not merely a co-signer. This mortgage was structured with you as the primary guarantor. Your son cannot make any legal moves without your authorization." The father leaned back slightly, a slow breath leaving his chest. "So, if I wanted to cancel it?" "You could," Harrington replied without hesitation. "It would be within your legal authority to revoke the arrangement. The house would no longer have your backing, and the bank would call the debt. If your son cannot cover it alone, and from what I see here, he would lose the property." The father sat in silence, the words echoing in his mind. He had suspected this, but hearing it confirmed ignited something within him. It was not glee. No, it was not so simple. It was a grim satisfaction, the kind that comes from knowing a door exists where before there had seemed only walls. Mr. Harrington studied him closely. "I must ask," he said carefully, "why you would consider such a step. It is a serious decision, and it will have consequences." The father met his gaze steadily. "Because I gave everything I had to that boy. My time, my strength, my future. And when I asked for nothing in return but respect, he shoved me aside and told me to leave." His voice did not rise, but it carried the weight of a lifetime. "I will not be humiliated in my own family, not after all I've done. If he will not honor me, then he will learn what it means to take everything for granted." The lawyer nodded slowly. "You understand this could ruin him financially." "I understand," the father said. His tone was calm, unflinching. "But he left me no choice." Harrington closed the folder and slid it back across the desk. "Then you have your answer. The power is yours. Whether you use it is up to you." The father placed the documents back into his satchel with careful precision, as though he were handling a loaded weapon. He rose, thanked his lawyer, and left the office without another word. Outside, the town bustled around him, people hurrying to shops, buses passing by, children laughing on the sidewalks. Life went on, oblivious to the storm quietly forming in his heart. He walked slowly down the street, each step deliberate. He now knew with absolute certainty that he held the future of his son's home in his hands. It was a sobering realization, but also empowering. No longer was he the victim of rejection, cast out like a burden. He was a man with leverage, with control, with the authority to strike back in the way only a patient, wounded father could. By the time he returned home, the decision had taken root in his mind. The house was quiet, the clock ticking steadily in the living room. He placed the satchel on the desk, opened it once more, and stared at the mortgage papers. The power was his. The question now was not whether he could act, but when. The following morning arrived with the heaviness of an overcast sky. The father rose earlier than usual, the kind of waking that came not from rest but from determination. He sat at his kitchen table with a cup of tea, steam rising in soft curls, his hands wrapped around the porcelain as though drawing strength from its warmth. The papers from the lawyer's office lay in front of him, spread neatly as if waiting for his signature, waiting for the choice that would alter everything. He stared at them for a long while, torn between the pang of guilt twisting in his chest and the steady flame of resolve that refused to die down. The guilt came not because he doubted his right, but because of what the act represented. This was his son, his only child, the boy he had once held close during thunderstorms, the boy he had carried on his shoulders when his legs were too short to see the world. And yet, that boy had grown into a man who had shoved him aside, spat words of cruelty, and told him to go away as if decades of sacrifice meant nothing. He breathed deeply, letting the memory of that night wash over him. not to weaken him, but to harden his purpose. Every shove, every insult, every moment of rejection had brought him to this threshold. By mid-morning, he picked up the telephone and dialed Mr. Harrington's office. His voice, when the secretary answered, was calm and measured. "Please tell Mr. Harrington that I would like to proceed with the cancellation we discussed yesterday, quietly. I don't want my son notified until the paperwork is finalized." The secretary, surprised by the gravity in his tone, promised to relay the message immediately. Minutes later, Harrington himself came onto the line, his voice steady but laced with caution. "Are you certain about this?" he asked. "I am," the father replied. "File whatever needs to be filed. Begin the process today." There was a pause, the sound of papers being shuffled on the other end. "Very well," Harrington said at last. "It will take some time, but the wheels will be in motion before the day ends. Once it's in motion, there is no reversing it." "I don't intend to reverse it," the father said. His hand tightened on the receiver. "Let it be done." When he hung up the phone, he sat for a long while in silence. The weight of his decision pressed heavily against his chest. A small part of him wondered if this was cruelty, if perhaps he was crossing a line no father should ever cross. But the other part of him, the part that remembered nights of labor, days of sacrifice, and years of devotion, reminded him that cruelty had already been visited upon him. This was not vengeance for its own sake. This was justice, quiet and unflinching. Later that afternoon, he walked into town and found himself at the park where he used to bring his son as a child. He sat on the same weathered bench where he had once watched him run across the grass, chasing balls and laughter. Now the park was filled with strangers, their voices and footsteps a dull background to his thoughts. He tried to summon an image of his son as a boy, but each time the memory surfaced, it was interrupted by the sound of his grown son's voice, harsh, cold, commanding him to go away. The guilt softened there on the bench, replaced once more by grim satisfaction. If his son had truly meant those words, then this was the consequence. If he had forgotten every lesson of gratitude, every thread of sacrifice that held his life together, then perhaps losing his home would be the only reminder sharp enough to pierce his arrogance. As the day waned, the father returned home, his steps slower but surer. He lit the lamp in his study and sat at his desk, the mortgage papers lying before him like silent sentinels. He ran his hand across them one final time, feeling the smoothness of the paper, the ink that bound them. It was no longer just a legal document. It was a symbol of the line he had drawn, the point of no return. That night, sleep came to him fitfully. Dreams of his late wife haunted him, her gentle voice asking if he was certain, if this was what she would have wanted. He woke with the echo of her question lingering. But as he looked at the satchel with the papers neatly tucked inside, he whispered to the empty room, "I have no choice." He made it so. For the first time since the shove, since the insult, since the rejection, he felt a strange sense of control return to him. The process was set in motion. The wheels of consequence were turning. His son would never see it coming, and when it arrived, it would be too late to undo. The father closed his eyes that night with the heaviness of guilt still present, but it no longer overwhelmed him. Instead, it coexisted with a grim satisfaction, a quiet acknowledgment that sometimes justice demanded the harshest measures, and he, at last, was prepared to see them through. The days that followed his decision unfolded with a strange serenity. The father rose at his usual hour, brewed his tea, and walked through the familiar rhythms of his life as if nothing had changed. To the casual observer, he was the same elderly widower, reserved and steady, but within him pulsed a newfound sharpness, a quiet edge honed by the knowledge of what he had set in motion. At the market, neighbors greeted him warmly, and he nodded with a calm smile. They saw no turmoil in his face, no hint of the storm gathering beneath his calm exterior. When asked how he was doing, he answered simply, "I'm well, thank you," his tone measured, composed. The words were not lies, for in a way he truly was well. For the first time in years, he felt a control over his life that no one could take from him, not even his son. His relatives, however, noticed subtle changes. At a small family gathering that weekend, he sat at the end of the table, listening more than speaking. His posture was straighter, his eyes sharper, and when others spoke, he regarded them with an intensity that made them pause. A cousin leaned over to whisper to another, "Doesn't he seem different? Stronger somehow?" He laughed at the appropriate moments, offered polite responses, but there was a quietness about him that seemed deliberate, purposeful. It was as though he carried a secret weight, one that did not burden him but steadied him like an anchor. His relatives could not know that while they shared food and stories, the father's mind was elsewhere, picturing the slow grind of legal gears now in motion at his lawyer's office. At church on Sunday, he stood during the hymns with a clarity of voice that had been absent for months. People turned, surprised at his strength of tone, but he only closed his eyes and let the words carry him. To them, it was a man finding renewed spirit in faith. To him, it was the calm that came from knowing justice was no longer a distant wish, but a certainty moving toward his son like an approaching tide. Even his demeanor at home changed. Where once he had slouched into his chair, weighed down by grief and rejection, he now carried himself upright, his movements deliberate. He tended to his garden with care, pruning the roses until their edges were precise, almost symbolic of the order he was bringing back into his own life. He prepared his meals with patience, each slice and stir measured, as though every small act reflected the larger plan unfolding silently beyond the walls of his home. It did not go unnoticed by his sister, who visited midweek with a basket of fruit. She studied him as he poured her tea, her brow furrowed. "You seem lighter," she remarked cautiously. "I don't know if it's peace or something else, but you carry yourself differently." He smiled faintly, setting the teapot down with care. "Maybe I've just learned to accept things as they are," he said. The words were true enough, though their meaning was known only to him. She tilted her head, unconvinced, but let the matter drop. He knew she sensed a change, but she could not see the documents tucked securely in his study, nor could she hear the ticking clock of consequence growing louder with each passing day. At night, as he sat alone in his living room, he found himself studying the silence. It was no longer oppressive, but comforting, a cloak under which he could think clearly. The guilt that had haunted him after calling the lawyer had softened into something manageable, a small ache rather than a crippling wound. In its place grew a deep, steady resolve. His son had asked him, in essence, to vanish from his life. Soon, the son would understand what life looked like when the foundations provided by his father were taken away. The calm was deceptive, even to himself. It was the calm before the storm, the stillness that precedes a crash of thunder. His relatives might not have understood why his eyes carried a sharper gleam, or why his voice had steadied with such conviction, but they felt it all the same. Something had shifted, and as he lay in bed at night, hands folded across his chest, he whispered into the darkness, "You'll understand soon enough, my son." The world outside continued as usual, the routines of life unchanged. But within his heart, the father carried the certainty that everything had already begun to change. The storm was not far off. It was coming, and he was ready. The envelope arrived on a gray Tuesday afternoon, delivered with the rest of the post through the brass slot in his front door. The father, who had been sitting in his armchair with a book resting unread in his lap, heard the soft thud against the wooden floor. Something in that sound made his heart quicken. He rose slowly, his joints stiff, but his movement steady, and walked to the door. There it was, an unassuming white envelope bearing the seal of Harrington Company, his lawyer's office. His fingers hovered over it for a moment before he picked it up, as though he were handling something alive, dangerous even. He carried it back to the living room, set it on the table, and sat down before breaking the seal with deliberate care. Inside was a letter, several pages long, and at the top in crisp black print were the words confirming what he had known would come. The cancellation of the mortgage had been executed. The legal backing had been withdrawn. His name, once tied to the foundation of his son's home, had been removed. The property now stood entirely under his son's responsibility, with no safety net, no shield, no lifeline. The father read the letter twice, then a third time, ensuring he understood every line. His lawyer's words were clear and professional. "Effective immediately," it read. "Your financial obligations tied to the property have been dissolved. The bank has been notified, and without your support, your son must assume full liability. Should he fail to meet those obligations, repossession will follow." Oh, he folded the letter slowly, laying it on the table beside him. For a long while, he did not move. He simply sat there, staring at the grain of the wood, letting the reality sink in. It was done. Not just imagined, not just planned, but real. The wheels of consequence were no longer in theory, they were in motion, unstoppable. A flood of emotions surged within him. Guilt pricked at the edges of his mind, whispering questions. Was this too harsh? Was there still a way back? But the memory of that night returned with brutal clarity. The shove, the insult, the dismissal. Go away. Those words had not been spoken in anger alone. They had been said with cold finality, as though erasing the man who had given everything. The guilt did not vanish, but it was overpowered by something else, a grim satisfaction. He stood and walked to the window, pulling back the curtain to watch the street outside. Children played on bicycles. A mother pushed a stroller. Neighbors carried groceries. Ordinary life moved on, unaware that in his hands, the fate of his son's life had shifted dramatically. Somewhere across town, his son remained ignorant of the storm about to descend. He returned to the table and ran his hand across the letter once more. It felt strangely light in weight, yet he knew the consequences it carried were heavier than stone. This simple piece of paper had the power to shake the very ground his son stood on. That evening, he placed the paperwork into a folder marked "Settled Accounts" and slid it into the drawer of his desk. The drawer clicked shut with a finality that echoed in his chest. It was not the click of revenge complete. It was the click of a door locking, one that his son would soon find barred when he tried to pass through. When night fell, the father lit a single lamp and sat in its glow, sipping his tea. His hands were steady, his gaze fixed. For the first time in weeks, his home felt balanced, as though order had been restored. He had not shouted, had not struck out in anger. He had acted with precision, patience, and authority. The kind of authority only a man who had given everything could wield. As he prepared for bed, He paused at the small photograph of his late wife on the mantel. He touched the frame gently, whispering, "It's done." He imagined her eyes, kind and patient, gazing back at him, perhaps questioning, perhaps understanding. He could not know, but he felt, deep in his bones, that this was the only path left. When he lay down to sleep, he felt the heaviness in his chest ease, replaced by something sharper, a quiet anticipation. Soon the calls would come. Soon his son would realize what had been taken, and the arrogance that once fueled his cruelty would falter. The execution was complete. The storm was no longer gathering. It had been unleashed. The world on his son's side of town was very different from the quiet solitude of the father's modest home. His son and daughter-in-law lived in a neighborhood where the houses were tall, trimmed with manicured hedges, and driveways glittered with expensive cars that seemed to change with the seasons. Inside their home, the air always smelled faintly of designer perfumes, polished wood, and catered meals that arrived in glossy bags from upscale restaurants. To them, life moved like a perpetual weekend. His son, tall and broad-shouldered, carried himself with the swagger of someone who believed the world bent to his convenience. His daughter-in-law, elegant and always perfectly styled, seemed to float rather than walk, her laughter echoing across the marble tiles of their home. Their days were spent entertaining friends, hosting dinners, and sharing curated photographs of their perfect lives on social media. They were oblivious to the quiet execution that had already been sealed by the father's lawyer. Every champagne glass they raised, every purchase they made, was done under the illusion that their comfort was unshakable. On a Saturday evening, they held yet another gathering in their home. Guests admired the new art piece in the foyer, the imported rug in the living room, and the shimmering necklace around the daughter-in-law's neck. Laughter filled the house as the couple entertained, their voices loud and confident. To their friends they appeared untouchable, a golden pair who had climbed effortlessly into luxury. But beneath the sheen of wealth, small hints of instability began to emerge. His son had been taking longer pauses when looking over his bank statements, frowning before quickly folding the papers away. There had been a brief, sharp call from the bank a week earlier, brushed off with a vague excuse about misfiled paperwork. The daughter-in-law, though skilled in masking anxiety, had caught the edge in his tone and asked questions he answered with forced confidence. "It's nothing," he had said, "just clerical nonsense. Still, the subtle cracks were there. Hairline fractures in the glass surface of their perfect lives. They remained unaware that the safety net, the father's signature, the weight of his name was gone. They believed their home was secure, that the mortgage was nothing more than a technicality easily handled, the way everything else had been handled. His son's arrogance was such that he could not imagine his father withdrawing support. To him, the old man was a figure of the past, someone to dismiss, not someone who could alter the foundation of his future. Meanwhile, the daughter-in-law scrolled endlessly through online catalogs, eyeing the next piece of jewelry, the next handbag, the next set of shoes. Packages arrived almost daily, delivered by men in uniforms who had begun to recognize the house as a regular stop. She spoke often of vacations, Italy, Greece, maybe Bali in the fall, and her son agreed distractedly, his mind only half in the conversation. It was in those quiet pauses that the first tremors of unease stirred. Sometimes, late at night, his son would lie awake and remember his father's eyes that evening of the argument, the wounded look, the silence that followed after he had said, "Go away." He would push the memory aside, convincing himself it meant nothing. His father was old, too proud, too weak to fight back. At least, that was what he told himself. Yet, fate was already circling. The signed papers sat in a drawer across town, their ink still sharp and fresh, each line carrying the weight of a future his son could not yet see. The storm was not approaching, it was already there, waiting, ready to break through the thin walls of their lavish life. On Sunday morning, the couple attended brunch at a fashionable cafe where they ordered plates of food too large to finish, sipping expensive lattes as though they were a birthright. The daughter-in-law laughed over her phone, showing her friends photos of their home. She spoke of remodeling the guest room, perhaps adding a hot tub in the garden. Her son smiled faintly, but there was a shadow behind his eyes. He knew something was shifting, though he did not yet know what. The bank had left another message. He had not told her. He promised himself he would take care of it on Monday. But Monday would not bring resolution. Monday would bring the first rumblings of the collapse. For now, they basked in the illusion of security, blind to the weight of the storm that hung over them, ready to strike. The storm inside the house erupted the moment the letter was read in full. The air turned thick, charged with the sharp edge of panic. His son stood in the middle of the living room, clutching the crumpled paper in his hands, his knuckles white, his face flushed with heat. His wife circled him like a predator, wounded and desperate, her eyes wild, her voice cutting through the air with every accusation. "This is your fault," she shouted, jabbing her finger into his chest. "You said everything was under control, that the payments were fine. How could you let this happen?" He snapped his head up, glaring at her, the vein in his temple bulging. "Don't you dare blame me. You're the one who spends like money grows on trees. Every week it's another handbag, another dinner, another luxury we cannot afford. Do you think this house pays for itself?" Her face twisted, the mask of elegance she usually wore slipping away completely. "Do not turn this on me. You were supposed to be the provider, the man who handles responsibilities. And look at you fumbling everything like a child. If we lose this house, it will be because you were too arrogant to admit you were drowning." Their voices escalated, bouncing from wall to wall until it seemed the entire house was shaking with their fury. Furniture rattled as she slammed the letter down on the coffee table so hard that a vase tipped and shattered on the floor. Shards glittered against the hardwood like tiny, cruel reminders of the life they had just cracked. His son grabbed his hair in both hands, pacing frantically. "You do not understand. This is not some mistake. Someone had to do this. Mortgages don't just vanish. This was deliberate." His eyes flicked toward her with suspicion. "Maybe you knew. Maybe you did something. What have you been hiding from me?" Her jaw dropped, her anger twisting into offense. "How dare you? Do you think I would sabotage my own home? You're losing your mind." The accusations flew back and forth like daggers, every word carved deeper into the fragile trust between them. She called him a failure, a man unworthy of the sacrifices she claimed to make. He threw back her own words, calling her shallow, selfish, a parasite who bled him dry to keep up appearances. Meanwhile, the walls that had once sheltered their comfort now seemed to close in, suffocating them with the weight of collapse. For years, they had lived as though invincible, lavish dinners, extravagant vacations, a house that sparkled like a magazine spread. Now, all of it trembled on the brink of ruin. The argument grew violent in its energy. Voices hoarse, hands gesturing wildly, objects slammed onto tables. Their child, too young to understand, but old enough to sense danger, hid upstairs, pressing small hands over ears to block out the fury below. Hours passed like minutes, the argument cycling from accusation to silence and back again. Every pause was filled with the sound of papers rustling, calculators clicking, frantic searches through files that yielded no hope. They found nothing. No hidden account, no miraculous escape, no solution that would undo the blow. The wife slumped into a chair at last, her face pale, her hands trembling as she reached for a cigarette she had long ago promised to quit. Smoke curled around her, a ghostly halo that made her look older, more brittle. "We are ruined," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Do you understand that?" Ruined. Her husband stared at her, chest heaving, face shadowed by desperation. His fists unclenched slowly, his shoulders slumping as the truth finally sank in. It cannot be. There has to be a way. There has to. But even as he spoke, he knew the truth. Their financial security, the empire they thought untouchable, was crumbling brick by brick beneath their feet. Upstairs, the phone buzzed. Downstairs, silence fell like a heavy shroud. For the first time, neither had the energy to argue. They sat apart, broken reflections of the once proud couple, listening to the faint hum of their life unraveling. In another house across town, the father sat in stillness, aware of the chaos his silence had unleashed. He had not needed to raise a hand or utter a threat. Their own arrogance had been enough fuel. The collapse had only needed one spark, and he had given it. And now the fire was consuming them. The father's modest house sat in silence that evening, the kind of silence that only grows deeper after a storm. The sun had long since set, leaving the rooms bathed in the golden glow of a single lamp beside his armchair. He sat there, unmoving, his hands folded neatly in his lap, his breathing steady. On the small table next to him lay his mobile phone, screen dim for now, resting like an undisturbed pond before a stone is thrown into it. Then the vibration began. The phone buzzed sharply, the screen lighting up to reveal his son's name. He did not move to pick it up. The phone rattled softly against the wood of the table, pleading in its mechanical way. When it stopped, the silence returned heavier than before. Moments later, it began again. Call after call poured in, each one a little more frantic than the last. His son's name filled the screen 30 times over, a desperate rhythm that echoed the collapse happening across town. The father sat still, his stern eyes fixed on the device, watching but refusing to answer. With every ring, memories surfaced. Memories of the shove, of the cold words, "Go away," of the humiliation that had cut deeper than any physical wound. Those wounds had festered into a grief that hardened, and now, as the calls rang out into nothing, that grief had transformed into something stronger: resolve. He imagined his son on the other side, pacing frantically, sweating, voice cracking with each unanswered attempt. He could almost hear the anger in the first few calls, sharp words, shouted demands, but then he could see the shift as anger gave way to panic, and panic melted into pleading. His son, so proud and arrogant, reduced to begging for the attention of the father he had cast aside. The father leaned back slightly in his chair, eyes narrowing with a quiet satisfaction. He did not feel joy at his son's desperation. Joy was too light, too frivolous for this moment. What he felt was justice. The buzzing returned again, this time longer, more insistent. The vibration rattled the phone against the wood, almost as if it were shaking with desperation itself. The father reached out slowly, not to answer, but to turn the device slightly, angling the screen so he could see the missed call count climb. Each number etched itself into his mind like a tally, a record of desperation. 10, 15, 20. By the time it reached 30, the screen glowed with proof that his silence had more weight than any words he could ever say. He thought of the years spent working double shifts, of the sacrifices made to put food on the table, of the lonely nights after his wife's passing when he had stayed strong for his son's sake. He thought of the joy he had felt when his son first graduated, when he first held the keys to his new home. All of it had been built with love, effort, and quiet endurance. And all of it had been forgotten, dismissed with a shove and an insult that still burned in his memory. Now, his son remembered him again, but only out of desperation. The phone buzzed once more. His son's name appeared again and again, relentless. Finally, the calls stopped, leaving the screen to fade back into darkness. The silence that followed was deeper than before. Heavy, final. The father sat there, unmoving, staring at the darkened phone. In that silence, he found his answer. He did not need to speak. He did not need to rage or explain. His absence of response carried more weight than 1,000 speeches. The unanswered calls themselves were a sentence. The silence, the punishment. He rose slowly from the chair, joints aching from age, but spirit steadied by purpose. He moved the phone to the far edge of the table, turned off the lamp, and let the room fall into shadow. His son's voice would not reach him tonight. Not tomorrow either. Perhaps not ever again. As he walked to his bedroom, the silence followed him, not oppressive now, but liberating. For the first time in years, he felt in control not through force, but through restraint. The phone remained on the table, screen dark, heavy with the weight of 30 missed calls, and the father slept in peace. The knock at the door came like thunder, rattling the quiet of the old house. It was not a polite knock, not even a hurried one. It was desperate, angry, heavy with the weight of someone who had run out of patience. The father had been expecting it. After 30 unanswered calls the night before, it was inevitable that his son would arrive in person. He did not rise at once. Instead, he set his teacup gently on its saucer, adjusted his glasses, and allowed the echo of the pounding to fill the hall. Then, with calm steps, he made his way toward the door. When he opened it, the sight before him was a mirror of ruin. His son stood there, hair disheveled, shirt wrinkled, sweat clinging to his brow despite the coolness of the evening air. His eyes were bloodshot, wide with desperation, his chest rising and falling with ragged breaths. He pushed forward, almost shoving his way inside before words had even formed. "Why didn't you answer?" his son shouted, voice cracking between anger and panic. "Why? Do you know what you've done? Do you realize what kind of mess we're in?" The father stepped back, not yielding the ground of his dignity but allowing his son to enter. He closed the door behind them, the soft click of the latch strangely final. His son paced like a cornered animal, waving his hands, his movements frantic. "The bank! They're saying the mortgage is gone, canceled, voided. They're demanding payment, immediate payment." "We don't have that kind of money. Do you understand what's happening? We're going to lose the house, everything." The father stood silently near the doorway, his back straight, his hands folded behind him. His expression remained calm, his eyes steady, refusing to mirror the storm raging before him. At last he spoke, his voice low but firm. "I understand perfectly." The simplicity of the words struck his son like a blow. He stopped pacing, turned sharply, and glared at his father. "You did this, didn't you?" His voice dropped, not with doubt, but with certainty. "It was you. You canceled it." The father neither confirmed nor denied. He simply lifted his chin slightly, his gaze never faltering. His son's anger surged. He stepped closer, fists trembling at his sides. "How could you? After everything, after all these years, you're going to throw us out? Do you know what this will do to me? To my wife? To your grandchild?" Still, the father remained unmoved. His silence was heavier than any argument. It filled the room, pressing down on his son until the younger man's fury seemed almost childish in contrast. "You think this is justice?" The son spat, his voice trembling with rage. "You think this makes you better than me? You've ruined us. You've ruined your own family." The father's lips pressed into a thin line. Slowly, he moved past his son into the living room, where the lamp still glowed softly. He gestured to the chair across from his own and spoke with a quiet authority that brooked no resistance. "Sit, if you wish to talk, but shouting will not move me." For a moment, the son looked as though he might explode, his body tense, eyes burning with the need to lash out. But something in his father's voice, the calmness, the steadiness, cut through his rage. With a frustrated exhale, he dropped into the chair, his hands clutching at his knees, head hanging low. The father sat opposite him, hands folded neatly. His face betrayed no malice, only an unshakable dignity. "You asked me if I know what I've done," he said evenly. "Yes, I know, and more importantly, I know why." His son looked up, eyes filled with fury and shame. "Why then? Tell me why you do this to your own blood." The father held his gaze, unflinching. "Because blood alone is not enough. Respect is earned, gratitude is shown. And when a son raises his hand against his father, when he tells him to go away as though he were nothing, he forfeits the shelter that father built for him." The words sank into the room like stones dropped into still water. His son opened his mouth to respond, but found no words. The fight drained from his posture, leaving only exhaustion and the bitter sting of recognition. The father did not raise his voice. He did not gloat. He simply sat in quiet dignity, letting the truth settle between them. At last, his son rose, unsteady, torn between defiance and shame. "This isn't over," he muttered, though the strength behind the words was weak. He moved toward the door, pausing only once to glance back, as if hoping his father might soften, might call him back. But the father remained still, his silence the final answer. The door shut, and the house returned to quiet. The father sank back into his chair, his heart steady. He had not been provoked, had not surrendered his ground. The confrontation had come, and he had stood unbroken. The next time his son came, he did not storm the door. There was no pounding, no shouting, no frantic rush of words spilling into the hallway. Instead, there was a timid knock, hesitant and uneven, like the hand that delivered it had trembled before it struck. The father rose from his chair, slower this time, and opened the door to see his son standing on the porch, shoulders slumped, eyes hollow from sleepless nights. For a long moment, neither spoke. The son shifted uncomfortably, his lips parting as though he wanted to speak, but could not find the right words. The father stepped aside, gesturing for him to enter. His son obeyed, moving into the living room with the gait of a man carrying more weight than his body could bear. They sat across from each other. Once again, the father in his familiar armchair, the son hunched on the edge of the sofa, hands clasped tightly together. Silence stretched between them, heavy but not hostile. The father studied his son carefully, the same way he had once studied him as a boy when deciding whether to scold or to guide. Finally, the father spoke. His voice was soft but firm, like the steady rhythm of a drumbeat. "Do you know why I did what I did?" His son looked up, shame in his eyes, but shook his head slowly. "I only know that I lost everything, that you took it away." The father leaned forward, resting his elbows lightly on his knees. "No, You lost nothing that mattered. What I took was a house, bricks, and mortar. What you lost on your own was something greater: respect, gratitude, and honor." His son blinked, confused and stung. The father continued, his voice unwavering. "Family is not built on money or property. It is built on the small things, on kindness, shown when it is hard, on respect, given even when tempers flare, on gratitude for the sacrifices that others have made for you. Without these things, no house will stand, no fortune will last. You can fill rooms with furniture and line shelves with gold, but if respect is absent, all of it will crumble." The words hung in the air, clear and sharp. His son lowered his gaze, his jaw tightening. He wanted to protest, to argue, but deep inside he knew his father spoke truth. The father's eyes softened, though his tone remained steady. "Do you remember who worked double shifts to send you to school? Do you remember who held this family together after your mother passed? I did not ask for gratitude in grand gestures. A kind word, a measure of respect would have been enough. But you gave me contempt. You raised your hand against me. You told me to go away, as if I were a burden rather than your father." His son winced. The memory, like salt, pressed into an open wound. "I was angry," he muttered, voice low. "I did not mean it, but you said it." The father interrupted, his tone cutting but not cruel. "And words have weight. They reveal what lies beneath. You saw me as an obstacle to your pride, not as the man who built the ground you stand on." Silence fell again. The son's chest rose and fell with unsteady breaths. He swallowed hard, his hands trembling. The father leaned back now, his posture calm, his dignity unshaken. A house can be rebuilt. Money can be earned again. But if a man loses respect for his own blood, what is left? Nothing. Without respect and gratitude, there is no family, only strangers bound by shared history. The lesson cut deep. His son's eyes watered, though he blinked furiously to hide it. For the first time in years, he felt small in the presence of the man who had raised him, not because his father diminished him, but because the truth did. The father's voice softened further, though it still carried the weight of finality. "You may think I punished you with this act, but I did not. I taught you. One day, when the noise of your anger fades and the dust of your pride settles, you will understand. Family is not sustained by possessions. It is sustained by love wrapped in respect, by sacrifice honored with gratitude. If you forget that again, nothing you build will stand." His son sat in silence, the words settling into him like stones sinking to the bottom of a deep river. He had come to rage, to plead, perhaps even to bargain. Instead, he had been handed a lesson that stripped him bare. The father rose then, not in dismissal but in quiet conclusion. He walked to the window, parting the curtains just slightly to let in the fading light of dusk. "I have nothing more to add," he said. "What you do with these words is up to you." Behind him, his son sat motionless, his head bowed, his pride broken. For the first time in his life, he truly understood how much more valuable respect and gratitude were than the roof over his head. The house was quiet again, the kind of quiet that once pressed down on him like loneliness, but now, in the aftermath of everything, felt like peace. The father closed the door gently after his son's departure, and stood in the hallway for a moment, letting the silence settle. His hands rested loosely at his sides, not clenched, not trembling, just steady. He walked into the kitchen, where the faint hum of the refrigerator was the only sound. On the counter stood a bottle of whiskey, half full, untouched for months. He reached for it now, his fingers brushing over the cool glass as though greeting an old friend. From the cupboard, he pulled down a single heavy-bottomed glass, its rim catching the dim light of the overhead bulb. He poured carefully, the amber liquid swirling and catching the light as it filled the glass halfway. The smell rose up to meet him, rich, smoky, comforting. He held it for a moment, staring at the liquid as though it reflected not just the present, but the long road that had led him here. Then, with a small nod to himself, he carried it to the living room. The evening was fading outside, the last light of dusk stretching thin across the horizon. He stood at the window, the curtain drawn back just enough to let him see the world beyond. Houses stood quietly along the street, their windows glowing with the warmth of family dinners, televisions, and conversations. Life went on, as it always did. But within him, something had shifted. He raised the glass slowly, not in a toast, but in acknowledgement, a salute to his own endurance, to the dignity he had refused to surrender even when pushed, insulted, and cast aside. He took a sip. The burn of the whiskey ran down his throat and spread warmth through his chest, but it was not the drink that made him smile. It was the quiet triumph. A faint curve touched his lips, not broad or boastful, but restrained, controlled like everything about his revenge. He had not raised his voice. He had not lashed out. He had not so much as lifted a hand. And yet, he had shifted the ground beneath his son's feet, teaching a lesson no words of anger could have driven home. He turned from the window and lowered himself into his armchair, the same chair where he had spent long nights worrying, grieving, and plotting. But now it cradled him in victory. He rested the glass on the small table beside him and leaned back, closing his eyes for a moment. His thoughts drifted, not with bitterness, but with clarity. He saw the years of sacrifice, the long shifts at work, the days he came home too tired to eat but still found the energy to help with homework, the times he denied himself small pleasures so his son could have opportunities. All of it had built the foundation his son now lived upon. And yet, for years, that foundation had been taken for granted. Until now. Now his son understood, or at least had begun to. The arrogance had cracked, the pride had faltered. For the first time in a long time, the father felt that balance had been restored. Not through cruelty, not through violence, but through patience, calculation, and restraint. The kind of justice that moved silently and struck deeply. He opened his eyes again, the smile still faint but more certain. On the table beside him lay the paperwork, the documents confirming the cancellation, the proof that he had acted not in desperation but with deliberate authority. He did not need to look at them anymore. The weight they once carried had already been absorbed into his quiet resolve. Another sip of whiskey, smoother this time, warmer. He thought of the days ahead, of the family gatherings that might one day resume, altered but not destroyed. Perhaps his son would rebuild, perhaps not. Perhaps his daughter-in-law would learn humility, perhaps she would not. None of that mattered tonight. Tonight was about something else entirely. Tonight was about his own peace. The father sat back, watching the last sliver of sunlight fade from the horizon, the stars beginning to prick the sky. His small smile remained, steady and unshaken. In that moment, he knew the truth that few ever realized. True revenge was not about destruction. It was about restoration, restoring dignity, restoring balance, restoring the quiet strength of a man who refused to be diminished. The glass in his hand was nearly empty now. He swirled the last drop at the bottom and lifted it once more, as if sealing a vow to himself. Then He set it down gently and folded his hands in his lap. The house was still, the night deepening outside, and there, in the calm after the storm, the father sat in quiet triumph, the faint smile on his face saying what words never could. The lesson had been delivered, the balance restored, and his dignity untouchable. Your time means a lot. Thank you for listening to my journey. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. To hear the next story, just click the box on the left.